Stephen C. Hayes es profesor de psicología de la Fundación Nevada en el programa de análisis de la conducta de la Universidad de Nevada, autor de 47 libros y casi 700 artículos científicos. Su carrera se ha centrado en el análisis de la naturaleza del lenguaje y la cognición humana y su aplicación a la comprensión y el alivio del sufrimiento humano. Es el desarrollador de la teoría del marco relacional RFT, una explicación de la cognición superior humana, y ha guiado su extensión a la terapia de aceptación y compromiso ACT, una forma de psicoterapia basada en evidencia que utiliza métodos de mindfulness, aceptación y valores. Es co-desarrollador de la terapia basada en procesos, un nuevo enfoque para las terapias basadas en evidencia en general. El Dr. Hayes ha escrito una cantidad de libros para público en general, además de sus numerosos libros para profesionales. Su primer libro, Sal de tu mente, entra en tu vida, escrito con Spencer Smith, llegó a ser el libro de autoayuda número 1 en ventas en los Estados Unidos. Su último libro, Una mente liberada, Cómo girar hacia lo que importa, relata la historia científica y personal de la flexibilidad psicológica y se encuentra entre los 800 libros más leídos en Amazon. Sus TED Talks y presentaciones en YouTube para el público superan los 1.6 millones de visualizaciones. Sus blogs en Psychology Today, Medium y otros medios han sido leídos más de 2.5 millones de veces. El Dr. Hayes ha sido presidente de la División 25 de la APA, de la Asociación Estadounidense de Psicología Preventiva y Aplicada, de la Asociación de Terapia Cognitivo-Conductual y de la Asociación de Ciencia Conductual Contextual.
Welcome to Peru once again, but this time virtually, right?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for accepting this invitation. It's a truly honor for me. Yeah, for me and for the people in Peru, in Latin America that, follow us in
Claro.
the chapter. And the way I would like to start this conversation is maybe landing in the reality, which is Peru, right? And the incredible country, and all this history what we have, this wisdom, and also these wonderful places where connect us with these spirituality things, right? The practices, but also a country with really social problems, like corruption is really rooted in our system, insecurity, violence, and inequity. So I'm thinking right now, for example, in the population I work with, which are women that young ladies, teenagers that live in poverty, that have experienced violence in certain point of their lives, and some of them are mothers already. How contacts have really impacted their behavior, their life, their vision of the world, like really,
Of course.
and causing all this anger, all this frustration. How do you think, my question would be, how do you think psychology is doing and is doing in their job to addressing these individual psychological problems that are going to land in these social complex contexts?
Well, if I can talk about just the relevance of ACT and the psychological flexibility model to the social level problems. ACT is a contextual approach, but it starts as a psychological approach. And psychology is a particular kind of part of greater complexity, the whole organism, I think, interacting with a history and a current circumstance. Yeah, but that's psychology. But those processes often have a social basis. even the fact that we're speaking symbolically, I think comes from our cooperative history. And I've written extensively about the cooperative basis in evolutionary terms of why Homo sapiens and some of the hominins pretty clearly developed this amazing thing you and I are doing right now that has taken many thousands of years to turn into what it is. I mean, even just 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, language was functioned differently. But its core and cooperation is important. But that innovation, then the impact of symbolic thinking, socially driven because it expands cooperation. Cooperation came first, then the expansion of culture and cognition, because that's just the kind of creatures that we are, begins to act right back on us, whole organisms with a history in a current situation. And so the ACT model unpacks a bit about how to create healthy flexibility, that create more openness, using the consciousness tools that come from language. And non-human animals are conscious, but not in the way that we are, not from a perspective-taking sense of self. And then meaning and purpose, where what we're doing allows us to say that even though we know we're going to die, we care about this in our life intrinsically, not because of rewards or things we'll be given, but because they're qualities of being and doing that we want to put in our life. All of that at the psychological level that came from the social and biological level, from our evolutionary history, culturally, and genetically and epigenetically, needs to be extended socially. So if you take, let's walk through them. Emotional openness doesn't have its full benefit until you're open to the emotions of others and you're able to take the sense of awareness that comes when we develop this perspective-taking sense of self. It doesn't have its full benefits until that perspective-taking is applied to others. And you extend emotional openness within yourself to your emotional openness in the betweenness of you and others. Cognitive flexibility doesn't have its full extension until you're able to take the thoughts of others and the opinions of others and have a genuine conversation and to hold multiple truths at the same time, your truth, my truth, and to be able to, and so on through each of the 6 psychological flexibility processes. Values are almost always social. You tell me something that you care about, a 99.9% likelihood it has a social extension, even if you say something like, I just want to appreciate beauty. Yeah, but I bet you want to share that appreciation with others. You're an artist. Maybe you even, live in a cave and you only do art for yourself. Yeah, but I bet you hope that someday someone will see that picture or read that poem or read that story and be uplifted by it. So in answer to your question, if we then think about the evolution of the social practices of groups, what in the psychological flexibility model can we put into the social models that are being developed in our world? And let me give you a very concrete example. We've allowed the field of economics and the advice that economists give to policymakers to be captured by 2 false visions of human beings that didn't come from psychology and, or to the degree they did, don't fit what we know about psychology. Top-down command and control doesn't fit human psychology. Nobody likes being told what to do. Your 3-year-old says, not that way, mama, I want to do it my way. Your 3-year-old. You don't like the government or anybody else coming in and saying, you have to do this way and this way and this way and this way, right? Conversely, bottom up, invisible hand, greed is good, private ownership doesn't fit the evolutionary history of us as a species. That's not how we evolved. That happened much later in our evolution. And I'm not saying private ownership is necessarily something we shouldn't have, but you look at what happens when you start simply feeding unregulated capitalism, and you create enormous disparities in wealth. Well, in our evolutionary history, I mean, there's a reason why once a year the kings had to sit in the middle while all the rest of the tribe told them what was wrong with them, or a reason why they had to meet once a week and have people bring their complaints, or a reason why they could be overthrown, another chief put in. Because, I mean, every group that evolved the way we evolved as social primates had a way, or it didn't survive, of picking leadership and decision-making processes where the persons who are part of the group got to be part of it. It doesn't have to be democracy. It doesn't have to look like anything like democracy. It can be agreement that there's a hereditary line of chiefs. Yeah, but you're going to build in accountability. You're going to make sure, because otherwise, sooner or later, one of those sons of a sons of a sons, if it's a paternal line, turns into an outright horrible dictator, and you got to figure out a way to overthrow him, or the group's not going to be able to cooperate. If you look at Lynn Ostrom's core design principles, for example, for which she won the Nobel in economics in 2009, I believe. Why did she win it? Political scientist. Because worldwide, we know that these narratives of command and control, or greed is good, bottom up, invisible hand, are false. And when you look at how peoples, I'll say indigenous peoples, but at one time we were all indigenous peoples, developed and survived, they did it by managing evolutionary processes at multiple levels, at the individual level and at the group level. And that's what Lynn Ostrom brought into being. David Sloan Wilson has made that very, very clear and really built that out, including with programs like Pro-Social, the attempt to take Lynn Ostrom's principles and the psychological flexibility principles, put them together, and then put them in groups around the world on purpose. So a long way of answering your question, which is this: the whole ACT community starts inside a psychological model, but it was always one that was holistic and was always biopsychosocial. But as we've developed these psychological flexibility principles, for us really to take advantage of understanding where they came from and how they can be useful, we need to extend them socially, both analytically and practically. And we need to be informed by new things that happen at that level of analysis, like Lynn Ostrom's design principles, very compatible, easy to understand. And oh, by the way, you also have a body, so the same thing is true with the suborganismic parts of you. Acceptance and all the rest isn't going to matter if you treat your body like hell. You'll die early, and you will not be able to live your values in the same way that if you treat yourself with the same kind of loving kindness psychologically, but treat yourself physically that way. Be careful about what you put in your body, exercise, nutrition. So I think we're now at an era where this biopsychosocial, multi-level, multidimensional model, aided by evolutionary thinking, can take advantage of what we've done inside the ACT community. And with humility, don't be thinking politicians should simply listen to you, but with humility, push for and demand that the behavioral scientists should have a voice in policymaking and in decision-making, and that we should treat these practices that are occurring in different countries as a kind of itself an evolutionary model of trying new things and keeping data on what we really want to be about in our country, in our nation, but also in our families and our organizations, but also in the world. And learn how to be more fully human at all these levels of analysis. And you look at the modern world and you can see we've made great progress on biology. We've made great progress on lots of things like being able to feed people who are hungry or treat disease. I mean, we're doing better even in things like violence. I know in your countries that's not possible. No, but if you look at how long people lived in the paleo period and how many wounds there are on their bones, you know, you live in a less violent world. But we've got to now bring our best scientific understanding to evolving our world on purpose, because we can no longer afford to just do it by accident and so pollute our world that we can't live in it, or so torture people that we lead to wars and conflicts and racial and ethnic conflicts and so on and so on and so on. So time's up. We got to figure out how to be more masters of our own fate in a way that is holistic and grounded in our wisdom traditions, our spiritual traditions, and the importance of nature and the net and so on. And I think ACT can help with that. Sorry for such a long answer.
No. Thank you for all that. I would like to ask a little bit about compassion. How does compassion, what is your work related with compassion, and if you have influence or not? I don't know. Tell me a little bit more what you think about.
Well, self-compassion and self-acceptance, the way we mean it in ACT, is almost the same thing. It adds some perspective taking. You're part of a larger group. The kinds of things that are in Kristen Neff's, let's say, social or self-compassion scale. And it correlates to like 0.7 with the AAQ and with other psychological flexibility measures. But it's fine. Different terms orient us sometimes in ways like acceptance can sound like putting up with things, and tolerance and resignation. No, that was never acceptance. Accepting your lot in life. No. It was never about that. In fact, the exact opposite. When people are more willing to take on their own emotions, they can challenge the existing system more freely. And one of the very first randomized trials on that, Frank Bond and Bunce 2000, showed that workers in a very difficult environment, when you teach them ACT, the stress goes down, but the demand for change goes up. Conversely, if you just teach them to change their environment to reduce the stressors, the demand for change goes up, but the stress doesn't go down. So why am I saying that? Coming back to compassion, because what I'm saying is that there's no reason to be clingy about your terms. Instead of acceptance, we could have said self-kindness. It might have been better. Self-compassion, it might have been better. I'm a little cautious about simply drawing principles from Buddhism, period, end of story, for example. Why? Because any wisdom tradition is culturally bound. They should be treated with respect, but no, as a scientist or a behavioral health professional or a behavioral science, with no genuflection, unless it's your spiritual tradition. Then you genuflect or whatever is required there. But we bring, our more analytic eye. And so something like when I am distressed, I remind myself I'm part of common humanity, an item more or less out of the self-compassion scale. Be careful about that. We've shown that if you extract out the covariance with what ACT measures give you, that item can actually go in a negative direction, because it can mean something like, there, don't be upset. You're just a human being. Yes, you're just a human being, put your upset in that context, but there, don't be upset is a dangerous place to go. Now, what is good about the language of compassion, in my opinion, is the ease with which it goes from the psychological level to the social level. And that's important for the reasons we just described. Psychological flexibility came from the social level. It doesn't make full sense until it's expressed socially. If you have values and you're not putting it in your relationships, then what are you doing? Because you look at your values, they have a social extension. Okay, so then your question becomes, what do I think about compassion and self-compassion also to include the social extension? And there, I think, if you take the steps to put emotional openness and cognitive flexibility into your social world, to put perspective taking and the empathy that then perspective taking asks you to open up to into your world, or you put joint attention and shared values and cooperation and joint commitments to change into your world, you're building a more compassionate, values-oriented environment. The tape that you sent me of the rope building to protect the bridge annually, incredible amount of cooperation. I mean, the most cooperative primates by 100 times over, at least. I mean, but you look at an event like that, you might say 1,000 times over. How many people had to work together to make that happen? And if you look at the tape as I did, you will see appreciation. You will see mutual support. You're going to see an interchange, even though there's a leader, there's a person who's the bridge builder. But that person has been taught, has to listen, is just in one community, has to listen to these processes that we're talking about are, I bet you that bridge builder has to have some compassion for how hard it is to do this, enough to know when to pull out the bananas and bread, that a simple meal is needed, but we're going to have to sit down and share a meal here together. So what I like about the work on compassion, and I've supported it with multiple studies, randomized trials, etc., is that it's a natural, easier way of talking about some of the things that the science of psychological flexibility is talking about in a way that lands well, with a few cautions, like I just mentioned one. Watch out for the ease for accidentally using some of the parts that are compassion in a way that might be suppressive. Lands in a way that I think socially extends and empowers the psychological flexibility skills that we need to face the demands of the modern world. So it's a reason why compassion-focused therapy is part of the ACBS community, why compassion-focused trials inside ACT are happening, why the hybrid of bringing these things together and never mind even what the label is in a process-based approach is happening very rapidly and naturally.
Mhm. Thank you, Steve, for that. I would like to talk or hear your opinion about ethics and CBS. I think it's important about ethics
Yes.
because thinking in our work with clients, as a clinicians, and also doing trainings, for example, for other people and get training from others. What's your thought around ethics and CBS?
Well, our biggest ethical requirement when working with human beings, I think, is their choice, their participation, their willingness. those same skills we were talking about apply to the provider. Taking the perspective of others, listening to what's being said, being open to what's being said emotionally and cognitively, understanding the values of the people that you're working with, even if they're not your own, and being able to enter into an agreement that's voluntary, even if you're dealing sometimes with court-adjudicated populations, with people who may be in jail or things of that kind, or people who're carrying this label of serious mental illness, with all of the unfairness and falsehoods that implies, due to the capturing of the healthcare system by a psychology of individual differences and diagnosis that's driven by racism and classism. And if you don't know the dirty history of your own statistics, you should. And I've talked about it multiple times. I'm about to write a book about it. I'm writing an article on it right now. And why that's important is the question you ask about our ethics. Our ethics, I think, need to start with the people that we serve, of bringing processes into the betweenness and into our own hearts and minds that allow us to stand with our clients, not on top and not because we know more, but because we're an ally. Now, the philosophical roots of acceptance and commitment therapy are in functional contextualism. Contextualism is a way of talking about a revised form of pragmatism. And cartoon versions of pragmatism says, if it feels good, do it. You will very quickly run into ethical problems if you do that. And what functional contextualism says is the way to square that circle of the selfishness that's possible inside pragmatism, or the Machiavellianism that could exist there, the way to do that is to have publicly stated goals that are shared with others and to be held to account to that. In the context of our conversation, there's another way to say that. The way to make pragmatism safe for the scientific world, where it has a history of doing a lot of good for reasons we can talk about, you need to start with the social world and with a transparent public disclosure of what you're up to and an invitation to others to hold you accountable for that or to join with you in cooperation and working to achieve that. What is that? Well, I just gave you a description earlier as part of that ethic that's in the CBS world, in which every voice matters and voices need to be heard, and they're not being heard unless they're being measured and modeled. And that takes you into very contemporary work right now on ACT as a form of process-based therapy and on ACT's historical resistance to the DSM and to any top-down normative categories that are put atop people's heads, whether in the area of gender or sexual orientation or religion or ethnicity or culture or religious groups, etc. So we've declared what ours are in ACT. We have an aspirational goal that we say, which is creating a psychology more worthy of the challenge of the human condition. Hold ourselves accountable to that. Not that we have created it, but that's the journey we're on. We scientifically say prediction and influence with precision, scope, and depth that is based on verifiable experience, and that in linkage to this higher order goal is harnessed to the pro-social purpose of science knowledge that you can use to create a better, fairer, more loving world. So I think that's our ethical obligation. Ethics and morals are ways that groups talk about what is good for us as a community and working out together what that may be. But then all of the spiritual traditions, almost without exception, and I will even say all the ones that I know of without exception, say that it also requires an individual affirmation on your part. If you look at your scriptural texts, for example, the deity or deities or whatever offer or make available wisdom, but you need to pursue it. You need to bring it into your heart and your head and your hands. Well, that's makes perfect sense and comes to the conversation we're just having. And I don't know if that fully answers what you're asking about, but I think cartoon pragmatism is dangerous. William James was no sooner laying out some of pragmatism before, people were saying things like what's good for General Motors is good for the country. Excuse me, that's bullshit. Unless you said, I want to create a world in which large capitalist firms are successful no matter what, as your first declaration, then you said to people, and anybody who wants to help me do that, come on in. Okay, I guess you want to play that game, at least declare it. But don't be hiding behind, it's true if it works, when you didn't give people a chance to vote with their feet. To say, excuse me, sir, I'm not interested in having gigantic capitalist companies control my fate. Just like in the same way that if a leader of an indigenous tribe marched in and said, we're going to do it this way, you try that and watch what happens over time. Evolution of groups will correct that, because that's just not the kind of creatures that we are. And so we will find a way. So in the same, I'm jumping around a little bit. I hope you can see what I'm weaving in here, is that crass pragmatism can be ripped off by the wealthy and powerful with words that disguise what they've done. And I think what we need to do as behavioral health care providers, as behavioral scientists and so forth, is hang tight to our assumptions and to come into the world in a way that's humble and serving, but where we listen first. What do people need and want from us has to be a place we begin. Nobody elected us to be masters of other people's lives. We enter into it with our scientific and professional knowledge, but we have to be humble and listen to what others say. And let me give you a concrete example in ACT. I'll give you two examples. One is, unlike a whole vast field of psychology now called positive psychology, we've never listed human virtues. You won't find it anywhere in the ACT canon. We ask people what their values are. Yeah, we define values as intrinsic to your behavior, things that bring meaning and purpose to you, not the goals and results of action, but the intrinsic qualities of action. Yeah. That comes out of the scientific side of things. And then we need to listen. What are those for you? And if they truly conflicted with ours, we'd say, I'm sorry, I'm not able to work with you. But in all my days, I've never run into that, ever. I've worked with rapists and pedophiles, and I've had them tell me things like, I just want to learn how to be better at molesting children. I've actually had people say things like that to me. Yeah, but then I push a little harder and they're weeping in my office about what they've done in the name of that to others. And so we don't need to be, as we say, Pollyanna-ish about it. It's an American story. I don't know that story, but that one of everything is roses and flowers. And I'm not saying that, but I am saying we need to focus on this ethical part of what we do. And there's a way to do that that's built right into the psychological flexibility model as socially extended.
Okay.
And could I say one more thing on that?
Yes,
And
sure, sure.
furthermore, if you want to empower an ethical, value-based journey of your clients, the same thing holds there. Because that client in front of you may have a hard time seeing what the essence is of that moral choice, which will include, I'm standing for this, but yeah, here's the problem. You hurt where you care. And if you really get clear about where you care, you're opening up the door to pain. So if you don't put flexibility skills into human hearts and heads and hands, you will see fused judgments as masquerading as values. You will see avoidance processes masquerading that way. And so you look at economic disparities, just as an example. The more disparate cultures become economically, the more conflict happens. But do you know also the more health problems happen? And here's the amazing thing, not just for those who are poor, but for those who are rich. If you're rich in a country with huge economic disparities, you're more likely to die early. Not out of violence, no. Out of what you have to do as you drive by beggars, of what you have to do in order to say, that's not my problem, when it's right outside your doorstep in a cardboard shack. So the suppressive processes that allow you to say things that this is what I care about when it's not really true, if you were to be more open emotionally, or you're able to take perspective, or be less cognitively fused, you'd have a different view. Those processes harm human beings, and they harm even the human beings who are driving around in Rolls Royces. I'm not saying wealth is bad. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying, you know, what we know, if you pursue wealth is another piece. You pursue wealth in order to avoid all those other things, it predicts unhappiness. You pursue wealth in order to be able to live a values-based life, it predicts happiness. You can do amazing things with wealth. So, and I'm going over there just because we're talking about a country where you started off the conversation, where whole communities are subject to violence and to exploitation and to natural resources being controlled by others, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the history of well, good grief in your country, the history of what happened with the Incas and the conquistadors and so forth. Oh my God, such an amazing civilization, you know, with thousands and thousands of miles of roads and being able to manage, and suddenly, you know, being treated as if these are peoples who deserve to be subjugated. Yeah. Still in the community history of people throughout that region as to what happened with that kind of arrogance. And I think sometimes driven by, you know, where's the gold? Because then we're going to get the gold. We're going to ship it back to Spain, and stuff that just was like, not what we should have been up to as human beings.
Thank you, Steve, for that answer. The next question have to do with interbehaviorism. It's something I'm reading a lot recently.
Yeah.
I would like to know your opinion about that, if it have influenced your work or not, or yeah, tell me a little bit about that.
Well, ACT comes out of behaviorism. It comes out of a wing that's usually called radical behaviorism, which is the worst name in all of human or all of psychology, because what was radical about it was taking behavioral principles all the way down to the scientist and the provider themselves. And because of that, blowing up almost everything that behaviorism stood for up to that point. So, for example, Watson was extremely skeptical of private events, of things that only you can see, and he was interested in thinking and so forth, and did some things that are contemporary, like talking aloud while you solve a problem, writing down a transcript of those words, and then using it to understand the problem-solving strategies, a strategy called protocol analysis that's used to this day in cognitive science. Came from John B. Watson. Okay. But his analysis of language led him to believe that there was no need to understand the private lives of people, that these were really just public, and even speech was just movement of the larynx. Now, it is true when you think, your larynx moves. You can learn to think with biofeedback without any action in your larynx. Because, yeah, of course, it starts in language. Higher cognition, symbolic reasoning, problem solving starts with, talking to your 12-month-old and saying, "This is a cup," and then getting their little baby head to look towards it when I say, "Where's the cup?" The beginning relational framing skills. I came out of a wing, the Skinnerian wing, that was radical in the sense that the original meaning of that word is not extreme, but to the root. That's what radical means. It doesn't just mean extreme. So it's not the extreme form of behaviorism. It's the one that goes to the root and says, okay, what is your history? What are the circumstances? How did you develop these perceptual skills, these cognitive skills, etc., and looking across the whole evolutionary history of you. I mean, B.F. Skinner is usually beat up on this, but his first studies were on tropism in ants. So don't be telling me that he wasn't sensitive to evolutionary principles. His dying words were variation and selection will be important to the history of psychology. And then he died the next morning after having written that sentence. A slight rewording of the sentence, but it's approximately right. But what happened by naming it that and by allowing that conception to happen. Oh, no, I want to take that thing. When you start applying it to the person, let me give you an example. Watson says you can't look within. My wing says, look, it's not a matter of whether it's inside or outside. That's all one. But it does matter how tight is your history of making observations when you make a scientific observation. Here's the example I use when I'm talking to students. I'll say, okay, if there's a rock star who's going to give a concert in your town, and a group of teenagers are out an early release from their high school, and they look down the street and they say, there he is, there he is. And then quickly the person disappears into a storefront. Could you imagine that they're all mistaken? And people say, yeah, they're looking for him. They're trying to find the rock star. He's going to come to town. They'd be so excited to see him. I say, okay, how about then let's just do a little experiment. And let me just ask you this. If they're all mistaken, should that be a scientifically valid observation? They all saw the star and they said, there he is. No, because it was driven not by seeing, but by the motivational state of wanting to see. And for goodness sakes, people, when they were looking through the early telescopes, could see people on the canals of Mars. People, Martians. There are no Martians, and there's no canals on Mars. But they saw them, and everybody, if I put you in a room and just put a light on, you'll see the light move. It didn't move. It just removed all other forms of visual stimulation. That would happen. When I'm giving this talk, I usually pull down the screen. I don't know, it's still have them now with projectors in classrooms, but pull down the screen so that on the blackboard I can write something. And I write these words: Paris in, and the next line down, I put the, and then the next line down, I write the spring. Okay. And then I say, I want everybody to look and see what's written on the board and write down what it says. I roll it up. I roll it down. I collect all the papers. I have 98% agreement that what they saw was Paris in the spring. That's not what's on the board. It's Paris in the spring. 98% agreement. Here's Skinner's point. If you look at the person's history and circumstance, who's a scientist, you realize that the prohibition of talking about the inner and outer world is artificial. Yes, if I say, I have a tummy ache, you need to wonder about the contingencies that established that observation and statement. But you have to do the same thing when people write down what was written on the board. And public agreement won't give you the answer. What will give you the answer? Understanding the history of that person called a scientist. In other words, a psychological analysis. In other words, epistemology, not ontology, is the focus, right? Well, that's a weird idea. That blows up everything. Suddenly, you're no longer standing on the firm footing of, I saw the rock star and I saw Paris in the spring. I saw it. Yeah, but you saw it due to your motivation to see the rock star, or your history of the phrase Paris in the spring. You didn't make a valid scientific observation. Well, then what is one? Well, you arrange conditions where you get to test whether or not you're really, as Skinner would say, under the control of the event observed. And that's the scientific method. That's the kind of things we do clinically to avoid us from our own prejudice, overwhelming our expectations, hopes, wish, desires theory from the voice that's being given, and the importance of measuring and modeling. Now we're into things that would take a little bit of discussion because some of it's very contemporary, in a way that reveals the individual and maybe peels back from your eyes this horrifying history of putting people into diagnostic boxes and thinking that 5 out of 9 symptoms is characterizing a human life, when it's a lie. It's a racist, classist lie, and has been from the very, very beginning. But so radical behaviorism is a form of radical contextualism. You'd be far, far better off in understanding what behaviorism is that's inside ACBS. There's lots of forms of behaviorism. Some are very different. Some of them are mechanical man, push, pull, click, click. So, SR learning theory, so that's not the wing. The wing that ACT is out of is this naturalistic, holistic, monistic, contextualistic perspective that says that in the stream of events that are all one, we can bring our own faculties to it and arbitrarily, to a degree, divide the one into elements, and then look to see, is that helpful for us as we observe and describe antecedents, behavior, consequences, motivation, but not as tinker toys, not as little Lego blocks, not as dominoes, not as pre-organized, but no, we're organizing, because our action of observing and describing is itself the same thing that we're talking about, is true in our talking about. That's a radical idea. That's why I call it radical behaviorism, to the root behaviorism. Even you and your opinions, scientists, need to be thought of in terms of streams that are broken up, that can be talked about in different ways, For what? Well, then tell me what your purposes are. And for Skinner, he said prediction and control. Now, then he said something very dogmatic. He said, and that's the purpose of all scientists. That's the purpose of all science. Well, that's bullshit. You don't have any right to tell other people what their values are, what their reinforcers are, what their motivation is. What he should have said is, and that's my purpose. And if you want to chase that, come on, help me out. Well, that's what we do in CBS. Because it turns out a whole lot of people, clinicians, behavioral health specialists, behavior change agents, policymakers, the world wants a psychology that will tell you how to do something to reach goals. And that we don't really want a psychology that's just driven by understanding. If what you meant by that is modeling the world, and then you can't do anything about it. And so you have tragedies like, billions of dollars spent on the DSM and outcomes that are no better than before we started. In fact, are arguably worse. Or you've got outcomes like, money spent on psychometrics and on brain science, and with it is not driven by pragmatism. And you end up with gigantic models. And I say, what can I do with it? Well, not much yet, but real soon. When will it happen? When will your cognitive science of reading give me a better reading program? When we really understand it. When will I know we really understand it? When I can model the whole, dude, I remember you told me that 30 years ago. You told me that 20 years ago. You told me that 10 years ago. Time's up. CBS did it the other way. ACT was developed in 1981-82. The first randomized trial in 1986. There was one in 1989, and then I shut down all that, and I just did that to get my first student a job. My next randomized trial is in 2001. Why? Because we need to develop the philosophical work, the measurement work, the techniques, the principles, not to lock them down and say this is true, but to have a sense of how to do this way. And then in 1999, to say, here's a book. 2001, here's the RT book. 2005, here's a self-help book. Gets written up in Time magazine, outsells Harry Potter for a glorious week. Suddenly the CBT world hates me, even though I was always part of it, because I'm bringing down their hero, who I sent my first graduate student to do training with. Rob Zettel went to Tim Beck's shop in 1984, just 2 years after ACT developed, and did the first ACT study. And then gradually, here comes now 1,100 randomized trials. And by the way, approximately 500 of them in lower and middle income countries. And approximately 400 in unindexed journals. But we found them and we put them up, and we keep doing it because every voice matters. That's true of our clients. It has to be made true of the lower and middle income countries. And yeah, they don't have the money for gold-plated doorknob randomized trials that only the weird, white, Western-educated, rich countries can even pull off. It's not even what we need to be doing anymore anyway. We need to reach the practice base, and where every voice matters with every individual or couple or organization or treating. Well, that kind of naturalistic, behavioristic, contextualistic tradition had a history of, we're going to go where nobody else wants to go. I mean, look, I know I'm doing a rant here, but if you look at B.F. Skinner's, one of his early students shows that the chronically mentally ill people who people thought were just had disorganized behavior, they're just nuts or crazy. I'm sorry for using words like that, but that's the words that were used. And he shows that no, you can take a person and they'll pick up an object and drop it into a box with regularity if you give them access to a cigarette. The early work of Ogden Lindsley. And it blew people's minds. It was like, They're not just completely disorganized. They're responsive to contingencies. That changed or developmental disabilities. I know there's problems there. We need to go on, but when my first week as a graduate student, I was taken by my mentor to a place where he was working with people who were then called mentally retarded. And the back wards were made of cement. They smelled of urine. And most of the inmates were naked, and they hosed them down with a hose. That's true. You talk about ethics. That's how people were treated. And who cared about it? The behaviorists cared about it because they said, we could do better. And you'd be arrested if you did that to people who had developmental disabilities today. And you should be. But we're still locking people up in mental hospitals because they hear voices. And there's people out there in the behavioral. So from the outside of the behavioral tradition, you think of it as mechanistic push, pull, click, click, domination, who's going to control the controllers, Clockwork Orange, all of that. The wing that I'm out of is every voice matters, model the individual, learn the principles, apply them where they're most needed. Don't get satisfied with so-called understanding until you can make a difference. What kind of difference? Prediction and control was said. I'd say prediction and influence, because sometimes control has a domination feel, plus it sometimes means eliminating variability. And that's not what we meant. We mean being able to be useful and to do that with precision, scope, and depth. So smaller number of principles that apply to a lot of things and that always cohere across levels of analysis so that the brain doesn't tell you something different than psychology, telling you something different than sociology. So something wrong in the fabric of science. And we want to build that together without reductionism or expansionism in psychology, but also without walling off psychology from the social level or from the genes, epigenes, organ systems, brain circuits, and so forth that are involved with parts of you. So I'm a proud behaviorist, but I want to have a conversation with you about what that tradition is. And unfortunately, I do have to say that some of the folks who call themselves behavior analysts now really are push, pull, click, click mechanists. Because as the contextualistic wing moved over into CBS, a hole was created and autism became the central focus, and they kind of grabbed on to that. And so modern day behavior analysts is a mix. And I'm still a behavior analyst. I still care about that community. But if you're horrified by some of the things that have been done in the name of behavioral principles, I'd probably be horrified with you in prisons or with neurodiverse populations or but the reason I slapped the table was remember the history, and there was a time when nobody cared except the behavioral people about people who had nothing, who were just locked in cages because somebody said they couldn't learn or they were crazy. And that should be remembered too. And to behavior analysts, I say, and now let's bring the best of what we know, which includes language and cognition and emotion and attention and values and all these things. And modern behavior analysts like Mark Dixon, let's say, will work with populations who can't even say, this is a cup, and try to bring them all the way up to the point where, and it has data now showing, as you build those relational framing skills, now ACT is needed. Before then, it wasn't. You don't need ACT if you're dealing with nonverbal populations. But you get beyond a mental age of 3, you're going to need it. That's too long an answer again, I guess.
Wow, the time flow really.
I'm giving such long answers.
An hour. Oh my God, man. Amazing, amazing. Have this moment with you. I think I'm gonna watch this video, I don't know how many times to
Well,
process
there's
all the.
time. There's time for one more question, or maybe even two. But
Ooh,
then I probably do need to move on. Are there things that I could be of use to you and to your
yeah,
community?
sure, sure. Maybe I would like to close this conversation by asking what are the most hopeful, what you're more hopeful about, like yeah.
Here's the thing I'm just so excited about and hopeful about, that brings all these things together. The clinicians who really like ACT, who relate to it, are almost always heartfelt clinicians. They're people who can feel in their own life what happens when psychological flexibility principles are put there. They can see it in the consulting room in their work with clients. They can see people who are stuck get unstuck and people's lives evolve in a positive direction. They're heartfelt people. The deep traditions behind ACT, and the reason it was even there is I'm a card-carrying behavior analyst who'd had a severe anxiety problem, and had a transformational moment. You can see it on my TEDx talk, where I realized that things I learned on Hippie Hill, or from, let's say, consuming things that today in some areas of the world are now legal, but then were not, or some of the things that I saw in some of the wisdom traditions I explored as a young person, that when I really got in trouble, some of those things were most helpful. And then taking the risk, or maybe having the fear of not stepping forward until I knew, of putting it on a development cycle that was as fast as I can go. And I'm a hardworking guy. I go pretty fast. I publish a lot of things, but not putting it out there as tools to be used, but as assumptions, processes, principles, techniques. So from 81 to 1999, nobody knows ACT is going on except a few people. And then the 99 book comes out, and then So My God, and then the Get Out of Your Mind and Your Life is written up in time and beats Harry Potter for a week. And suddenly my CBT colleagues want to kill me because John Cloud, the guy who wrote the Time story, thought it would sell more magazines to write it as a war between me and Tim Beck, one of my heroes and one of the earliest helpers of ACT. First randomized trial on ACT was done only with his help. Wouldn't have happened without it. So now we're in this incredible journey where, ACT is around the world and all of that. And I'm most excited because the meta that was always in that was finding the high precision, high scope principles that could be combined in ways that would help us really see the person and what they need. Functional analysis, if you want an old word for it, instead of just categorizing them, would help us to see the complexity in front of us and to bring that heart and the head and the hands into progressive field that would lift the lives of others. Well, that took me in a process-based therapy direction. ACT as a form of process-based therapy. As evolutionary science came in with the work with David Sloan Wilson and multi-level selection and all of the work that I did with him, and the process focus with Stefan Hoffman and Joe Starocci, and now Biljendra Sadra, an awesome new editor of JCBS. And by the way, a person of color from India who is in a religious minority group, the Sikhs, and really understands a lot about those diversity level issues. She and I and others are writing an article on all the lower and middle income country studies on ACT that have been done, randomized trials in the last 20 years. Oh, this is a very long paragraph, not yet with the punchy part of it. We have recently in this journey realized that we have very, very, very new ways of modeling the individual scientifically that allows their voices to be heard. And it's so different that it's shocking. That we now have a study, one that just came out in JCBS. Baljinder Sadra is a senior author. If you're the Peruvian ACBS chapter, if you're an ACBS member, you can go to JCBS for free. Look at Baljinder Sadra, Sahdra, in the new articles, and there's one on values and our emotional well-being. And in there, it shows that the statistical analytic tools that we're using to try to model processes in people that are modern and new, and supposedly we finally learned the lesson that it's not just the average person, but that each individual person needs to be modeled through multi-level modeling and things like that, modern statistical tools, that those tools massively distort the individual, massively distort it, and that there's a relatively easy solution that clinicians would understand, which is to model the evolution over time of the individuals you're working with, and then take the places that turn them down and correct it, and the places that have lifted them up but then haven't been retained, and putting it in. In other words, learn how to involve a human life by looking in careful detail as to what has happened to them in their life. We can do that statistically. We can do that clinically. We can shape up our skills to see those processes so we don't just have to do it with numbers and questionnaires. We don't need psychometrics. Psychometrics distorts people massively. What we need is wearables and good questions and even ways of speaking that fit the population. And I was talking earlier about this when I started to get into why we need to listen. I'll give you an example. In Canada, there's a whole theory of values that Indigenous peoples in Canada understand that has like 7 aspects of all values choices being written up by an Indigenous person there into a book. You can't just take when I said we never listed the virtues, we listen, you just can't even take your Western mind expectations and take, an Indigenous person from Canada and really hear them unless you can have a model as to how to even measure that. And we've now developed measures where you can, with your client, come up with a self-report item and know that it's empirically validated, even though it's entirely in their voice and not drawn from any freaking scale that was probably validated, quote unquote, with a bunch of college students in England. So the thing I'm most excited about is this ideographic sensitivity that came out of the tradition I'm in. I mean, after all, I'm in a weird form of learning where you do it one animal at a time. And then if it works, see, can you extend it? And principles like reinforcement were developed that way. It was never done by a big group. Well, clinicians are doing that every day, but they're hiding from their supervisor that they're doing things that are not in the protocol. If they've got a hardcore says, we'll need an evidence-based if you're treating a syndrome with a protocol. It's nonsense. So the most exciting thing happening right in front of me right now is the rebirth of functional analysis inside process-based approaches, with now having statistical tools drawn especially from artificial intelligence and from very new methods that are just now being published and are just now, the article I mentioned, showing you the problem that we've been living inside, where the scientists have been lied to by their own analytic methods, and then they've been lying to the clinicians, who are then lying to their clients. And all of it driven by a dirty history of biostatistics and by the commercial interests of big pharma. And that we finally have, I think, a way in that will bring the scientists and the clinicians together in this new effort to really understand and model. And I want to echo a sentence I said earlier. I said something that people who have heart, the people we're working with, understand, which is that every voice matters. This human voice, this person in front of you, their life, their thoughts, their views, their culture, their problems, their aspirations matter. But then I said something that at the time might have just like, And I said, and if you're not measuring and modeling, you're not listening. Because if you're going to be an evidence-based clinician, given that we know that just heart doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. How do we know that? Experience doesn't predict competence. In clinicians, experience predicts confidence, not competence. It's a horrifying finding. It's been found in every meta-analysis that ever looked at it, which means the time you sit there listening and trying isn't going to necessarily make you better. Well, what will? Good science will, that will orient you to the right things so that the right feedback is seen so that you can begin to learn by your experience. And I think that's been happening in the ACT community. We do have some evidence that experienced ACT clinicians are better. One of the few parts of psychology that do. And we know some of why. You can read processes better. We now can line up the researchers in a way that instead of lying to you and hiding the truth from themselves, they're not lying on purpose. They're lying because the tools are lying to them. That if the deities will give me another 10 years to live, I think I'll see the arc of this. If not, put it in the history books and somebody else will see it happen, is that we are going to figure out a way. And I think we're now hot on the trail as to how to measure and model individual human lives in a way that empower clinical work and lead to better outcomes. And if we can get there, then the research base shifts from the gold-plated randomized trials in the weird world into the practice base of the entire world. And we will learn a lot where clients are treated in a way where every voice matters, and clinicians and researchers around the world are treated in a way where every voice matters. And what you're learning in Peru is as important to our worldwide development as what you're learning in New York.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this conversation this time.
Yeah. If people want to follow my work, I do what I say, go to stephenchayes.com, click on yes, please send it to me. You got on my newsletter list. These things that I'm talking about in terms of analytic tools, you'll find in JCBS. So if you're an ACBS member, you have an easy way in. I suggest you consider joining the process-based therapy SIG and ACBS if you're an ACBS person. I would ask you to look at what's happening with PsychFlex and MindGrapher. Not yet available in Spanish, but MindGrapher, our case conceptualization and monitoring tool, will have Spanish translation items within about 4 weeks.
Great.
And already and I have a conflict of interest here because the PsychFlex is a commercial thing, although I've not made a nickel from it and probably won't for many years, giving money to it. But that app is in there so that clinicians will want to use the other app so that we can get the data so we can put it in a data-identified database that will allow us to learn how best to do what I'm talking about. It turns out it takes massive numbers of people to really understand individuals. It's an irony, but it's true. But they need to be modeled and measured in order to do that. So if you're interested in that part of it, psychflex.com or IBH, Institute for Better Health.com will take you into that part of my world. And with
Awesome.
that, I hope I've been useful, my friends.
Yes, thank you, thank you. Have a lovely day, okay?
Peace, love, and life to y'all. Ciao.
Bye-bye. Bye.